The void stretched endlessly, a silent and unyielding expanse of darkness. Stars flickered faintly in the distance, cold and indifferent witnesses to the galactic sovereignty's dominance. The Dominion's Edge, a colossal flagship bristling with weapons and shields, glided through this emptiness like an apex predator. Its hull gleamed under the faint starlight, a symbol of power and control. High Overseer Calyx stood on the command deck, his gaze sharp and unwavering as he observed the vastness before him. His uniform was immaculate, adorned with medals that spoke of countless victories. Around him, the hum of machinery and the quiet murmur of officers at their stations filled the air. This was his domain, and he ruled it with pride. But then, the silence of space was broken. It began as a faint distortion, a ripple that shimmered in the distance like heat waves on a desert horizon. The officers noticed it first, their voices rising in confusion as they reported the anomaly. Calyx turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. The ripple grew, twisting, and bending the very fabric of reality, until it erupted into a gaping tear, a wound in space itself. From this gash in the void emerged a ship, but it was unlike anything Calyx or his crew had ever seen. The vessel seemed alive, its jagged, black surface shifting as though it breathed. Crimson veins pulsed across its hull, casting an eerie glow that danced across the darkness. The ship moved with an unnatural grace, gliding forward like a predator stalking its prey. Calyx felt a chill crawl down his spine. This was no ordinary ship. It exuded an aura of menace, a presence that seemed to press against the minds of everyone aboard the Dominion's Edge. "Scan it," Calyx ordered, his voice firm despite the unease gnawing at him. The officers obeyed, but their instruments failed. The scanners returned nothing, no readings, no data, as if the ship didn't exist at all. Calyx frowned, his jaw tightening. "Deploy drones," he commanded. The small, nimble machines shot out from the flagship, their lights blinking as they approached the mysterious vessel. But as they drew near, they simply vanished. No explosions, no debris, just silence. It was as if the ship had swallowed them whole. And then, it spoke. The voice didn't come through the speakers or the communication channels. It bypassed every system, reaching directly into the minds of every being aboard the fleet. It was cold and venomous, dripping with rage that felt ancient and unrelenting. "You thought we were gone. You thought you had won. Now, we return to take what is ours." Calyx froze. The voice was human. The words echoed in his mind, each syllable heavy with accusation and wrath. Humanity. The very name sent a jolt of shock through him. Humanity was supposed to be extinct, wiped out ages ago during the siege of Terra. The sovereignty had ensured it. They had burned Earth and hunted its people to the last. And yet, here it was. The ship, now identified as Eclipse's shadow, began to move. It didn't fire missiles or lasers. Instead, it released a pulse, an invisible wave of energy that rippled outward. The shields of the Dominion's Edge flickered and collapsed, their once impenetrable defenses falling like cobwebs before a storm. Calyx watched in horror as the rest of his fleet suffered the same fate. Ships lost power, their lights dimming as the pulse rendered them helpless. One by one, they succumbed, drifting lifelessly in the void. There was no explosion, no fiery destruction, only silence and stillness, as if the ships had been erased from existence. The High Overseer's hands gripped the edge of the command console, his knuckles white. This was no ordinary attack. This was not war. This was judgment. The council chamber of Zarinth Prime was a cavernous, foreboding space, carved from black stone that seemed to drink in the light. Massive pillars lined the room, their surfaces etched with the victories of the galactic sovereignty, scenes of planets conquered, species subjugated, and humanity's final defeat during the siege of Terra. But today, those carved triumphs felt hollow, like the mocking whispers of ghosts. Sovereign Emperor Varric stood at the head of the chamber, his imposing figure casting a long shadow over the council table. His robes gleamed a deep crimson, the color of authority and blood, and his face was a mask of tightly controlled rage. His golden eyes burned with a fire that threatened to consume the room. "Explain this," Varric demanded, his voice echoing through the chamber like a thunderclap. "Explain how an entire fleet, our fleet, was annihilated without warning, without resistance. Explain how humanity, a species we erased from existence, has returned to haunt us." The councillors exchanged uneasy glances, their once proud faces now pale with fear. None dared to speak until Commander Thaler, the head of intelligence, rose from his seat. His uniform was pristine, but his hands trembled as he placed them on the table. "Your Eminence," Thaler began, his voice steady but strained. "The vessel that destroyed Calyx's fleet, the Eclipse's Shadow, operates with technology that defies everything we know. Its energy signature is untraceable, its design unlike anything recorded in our archives. Our sensors, they cannot even perceive it." The room fell deathly silent. The councillors, seasoned leaders of the sovereignty, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The idea of an enemy they could not detect, let alone understand, was a nightmare made real. Varric's eyes narrowed, his fury simmering just beneath the surface. "And the weapons? What of them?" Thaler hesitated, his throat tightening as he spoke. "The weapons are not weapons as we know them. They leave no physical trace, no debris, no wreckage. It is as if the ships they strike simply cease to exist. We cannot explain it." A murmur rippled through the council, the sound of fear barely concealed beneath layers of decorum. Varric slammed his fist onto the table, silencing them instantly. "Unacceptable," he hissed. "We are the sovereignty. We do not bow to ghosts or shadows. What else have you learned?" Thaler swallowed hard, his face pale. "There is more, Your Eminence. A reconnaissance probe, sent to investigate the wormhole, managed to capture a transmission before it was destroyed. The footage was leaked before we could contain it." He gestured to an aide, who activated a holographic display in the center of the table. The image flickered to life, showing a vast expanse of space. Emerging from the swirling chaos of the wormhole was a fleet of ships, each as menacing and unnatural as the Eclipse's shadow. Their black, jagged hulls glinted with the same crimson veins, pulsing like the heartbeat of some ancient beast. The names of the ships were etched into their sides, glowing faintly in the darkness: Retribution, Ashen Dawn, the Revenant's Call. Each name carried a weight, a promise of vengeance that sent a chill through the room. The footage ended abruptly, the screen going dark. The silence that followed was suffocating. "They are not alone," Thaler said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "The humans have rebuilt their fleets. And if the Eclipse's shadow is any indication, their technology far surpasses our own." The council erupted into chaos. Some councillors shouted in disbelief, their voices rising in anger and denial. "This is absurd," one bellowed, slamming his hand on the table. "They cannot possibly be a threat. We exterminated them centuries ago. This is nothing but a remnant, a desperate attempt to frighten us." "Desperate," another countered, her voice trembling with fear. "An entire fleet was destroyed. If this is desperation, what would their full strength look like?" "They are few in number," the first councillor insisted, his tone dismissive. "A nuisance, nothing more. We will crush them as we did before." But others were not so confident. "And what if we cannot?" an elderly councillor asked, his voice heavy with dread. "What if this is not a remnant, but a reckoning? We erased them, their worlds, their history. We thought we had silenced them forever. But what if we were wrong? What if they have returned to make us pay for what we did? The room descended into heated arguments, the counselors' voices blending into a cacophony of fear and denial. Varric stood silently, his gaze fixed on the darkened holographic display. His mind raced, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a crushing tide. Finally, he raised his hand, and the room fell silent once more. "This is not the time for panic," Varric said, his voice cold and commanding. "Humanity may have returned, but we are the sovereignty. We will not be undone by the ghosts of our past." But as he spoke, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind, a shadow of fear he would never admit to. For in the depths of his heart, he could feel it, the sovereignty's greatest sin, the erasure of an entire species, had come back to haunt them. And this time, the ghosts were not content to fade into the void. They had returned, and they were hungry for vengeance. On the desolate prison moon of Chord 7, the atmosphere was oppressive, a haunting reminder of isolation and despair. The barren landscape stretched endlessly under a sky perpetually shrouded in storm clouds, casting the entire moon in a perpetual twilight. Deep within the bowels of this forsaken place, a solitary cell held a man who had long been forgotten by the galaxy. Darren Vale, once a proud soldier of the Vanguard Corps, sat in the dim confines of his cell. His body bore the scars of countless battles, his spirit weathered by years of captivity. The walls around him were cold and unyielding, much like the guards who taunted him as a relic of a species erased from existence. Yet, in the depths of his eyes, there remained a flicker of defiance, a stubborn ember of hope that refused to be extinguished. For decades, Darren had endured the solitude, each day a monotonous echo of the last. He had been captured during the fall of Terra, a living symbol of humanity's defeat, mocked and ridiculed by those who believed his kind were nothing more than ghosts of the past. But deep within his heart, he held onto the memory of his home, the vibrant blue planet that had been reduced to ashes. The monotony of his existence was shattered one fateful day when the prison's alarms blared to life, their shrill cries piercing the silence like a knife. The ground trembled beneath Darren's feet, and the air was suddenly thick with the acrid scent of smoke and burning metal. Chaos erupted around him, the sounds of battle echoing through the corridors as prisoners and guards alike scrambled in confusion. Amidst the pandemonium, a shadowy figure emerged from the swirling smoke, moving with the grace and precision of a predator. Clad in dark combat armor that seemed to absorb the very light around her, she was a specter of vengeance incarnate. Her presence was commanding, her movements swift and purposeful as she approached Darren's cell. The figure paused before him, her gaze piercing through the visor of her helmet. With a swift motion, she deactivated the cell's security field, the shimmering barrier dissolving into nothingness. "Darren Vale," she spoke, her voice a mixture of steel and fire. "I am Ceres Kale, a survivor of the siege of Terra." Darren's heart skipped a beat. The name was familiar, a whisper from the past, a reminder of the resilience that humanity had once embodied. He rose to his feet, his muscles protesting after years of disuse, and met her gaze with a mixture of disbelief and hope. Ceres extended a hand, her expression fierce and determined. "The sovereignty thought they could bury us," she declared, her words carrying the weight of unyielding resolve. "But they only planted the seeds of their own destruction." In that moment, Darren felt a surge of energy course through him, a rekindling of the fire that had once driven him to fight for his people. He grasped her hand, a silent pact forged between two survivors of a forgotten war. Together, they navigated the chaos of the prison, their path illuminated by the fires of rebellion that burned brightly across the galaxy. The prison break was not an isolated incident, it was part of a grander scheme, a series of coordinated strikes orchestrated by the newly formed Eclipse Rebellion. This uprising, born from the ashes of humanity's defeat, was spreading like wildfire, igniting hope in the hearts of the oppressed on dozens of worlds. As they emerged into the open air, the storm clouds overhead parted briefly, revealing a glimpse of distant stars twinkling in the void. It was a sign, a promise of the battles yet to come and the dawn that awaited beyond the darkness. The sovereignty's hold was beginning to weaken, its iron grip slipping as the flames of resistance spread. And in that moment, Darren Vale understood that he was no longer a relic of a dead species. He was a harbinger of change, a soldier reborn in the crucible of rebellion, ready to fight for the future of a galaxy on the brink of awakening. The Dominion's Edge, a colossal sovereignty warship, drifted through the void like a predator surveying its domain. Its hull gleamed with the cold, sterile light of the stars, a symbol of the sovereignty's unyielding power. But tonight, the air aboard the ship was thick with an unspoken tension, a quiet unease that rippled through its corridors like a shadow. Ceres Kale and her team had infiltrated the ship under the cover of darkness, moving like phantoms through its labyrinthine halls. The sovereignty's soldiers, confident in their dominion, never saw them coming. Each step the team took was deliberate, each strike swift and merciless. The walls, once pristine, were now stained with the evidence of their passage. Silent bodies crumpled in the shadows, their weapons still clutched in lifeless hands. Ceres led the way, her dark combat armor blending seamlessly with the dim lighting. Her every movement was purposeful, her every breath steady despite the storm raging within her. This was more than a mission, this was justice long overdue. At last, they reached their destination, the private quarters of High Overseer Calyx, the architect of Earth's destruction. The door loomed before them, an imposing barrier that seemed to pulse with the weight of the atrocities committed behind it. Ceres raised her hand, signaling her team to hold position. She would face him alone. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing a room bathed in cold, artificial light. High Overseer Calyx stood at the center, his back to the door, gazing out at the expanse of stars beyond the viewport. His figure was tall and rigid, clad in the ornate robes of his station, their gold and crimson threads a mockery of the blood spilled in his name. He turned slowly as Ceres entered, his piercing gaze locking onto her. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze, the weight of their shared history hanging heavy in the air. "I know you," Calyx said, his voice calm but laced with a faint undercurrent of unease. "Ceres Kale. One of the last defenders of Terra." Ceres stepped forward, her boots echoing against the polished floor. Her helmet retracted, revealing a face hardened by years of loss and struggle. Her eyes burned with a fire that had not dimmed since the day she watched her world fall. "You remember me," she said, her voice steady but cold. "Good. Then you'll know why I'm here." Calyx's expression remained composed, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, fear, perhaps, or the dawning realization that his time had come. "You think this will change anything?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. "The sovereignty is eternal. Your rebellion is nothing more than a fleeting spark, doomed to be extinguished." Ceres tilted her head, a faint, bitter smile playing on her lips. "That's where you're wrong," she said. She gestured to the small device clipped to her armor, its red light blinking steadily. "This isn't just for you. It's for the galaxy." With a single press, the device activated, broadcasting their confrontation to every corner of sovereignty-controlled space. Across the galaxy, countless screens flickered to life, displaying the image of Ceres Kale standing before the man who had orchestrated the annihilation of her people. Calyx's composure cracked, his eyes narrowing in fury. "You dare," he began, but Ceres cut him off. "This is for Terra," she said, her voice ringing with unshakable resolve. "This is for humanity. The sovereignty will fall." Before Calyx could respond, Ceres moved. Her blade, a weapon forged in the fires of rebellion, flashed through the air, its edge gleaming with deadly purpose. The strike was swift and final, a single, decisive blow that ended the life of the man who had once held the galaxy in his iron grip. Calyx's body crumpled to the floor, his blood pooling around him in stark contrast to the pristine white of the room. Ceres stood over him, her expression unreadable, the weight of her actions settling over her like a shroud. The broadcast continued, capturing the image of the High Overseer's lifeless form at her feet. Ceres turned to face the camera, her gaze unflinching. "To all who suffer under the sovereignty's rule," she said, her voice strong and unwavering, "rise. The time for fear is over. The time for rebellion is now." The transmission ended, but its impact was immediate and profound. Across the galaxy, colonies long silenced by the sovereignty's oppression declared their independence. Soldiers, once loyal to the regime, abandoned their posts, their faith in the sovereignty shattered. On countless worlds, rebel banners were raised, their colors bright against the darkness of tyranny. The sovereignty had always relied on fear to maintain control, but now, that fear had been turned against them. The execution of High Overseer Calyx was not just an act of vengeance, it was a spark, igniting a fire that would spread across the stars. As Ceres and her team vanished into the void, leaving the Dominion's edge in chaos, the galaxy began to awaken. The sovereignty's grip was slipping, its foundations crumbling under the weight of its own hubris. And amidst the rising tide of rebellion, a single truth became clear. Humanity was no longer a memory. It was a force, unrelenting and unstoppable, and it would not rest until the sovereignty was nothing more than a shadow of the past. In the heart of the sovereignty's most impenetrable fortress, Emperor Varric loomed over a console glowing with ancient, forbidden symbols. His face, carved with lines of desperation and fury, was a mask of cold determination. The rebellion had spread farther and faster than he could have anticipated. Worlds that once cowered under his rule now burned with defiance. His empire, once unshakable, was fracturing. He clenched his fists, his voice a low growl as he uttered the command that would change the course of the galaxy. "Activate the Dread Forged." The room fell silent, the air heavy with the weight of those words. Even his most loyal advisors flinched, their faces pale. The Dread Forged were not a weapon of control, they were a weapon of annihilation. Born from the darkest days of the Siege of Terra, these monstrous constructs had been forged to destroy entire civilizations, leaving nothing but ash and ruin in their wake. They were a legacy of terror, locked away for centuries because even the sovereignty feared their power. But now, Emperor Varric had no choice. His empire was crumbling, and he would see it burn before he let it fall into the hands of rebels. Across the galaxy, the Dread Forged awoke. They emerged from hidden vaults buried deep beneath the crusts of forgotten worlds, their colossal forms shrouded in shadows and dust. Each one was a monstrous fusion of metal and flesh, their towering frames bristling with jagged armor that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Their eyes, glowing with a sickly, unnatural light, radiated a malevolent intelligence. These were not mere machines. They were alive in ways that defied comprehension, their bodies infused with genetic technology that made them far more than the sum of their parts. They moved with a terrifying grace, their steps shaking the ground, their voices a chorus of metallic roars that echoed across the stars. The first targets were the rebel strongholds, colonies that had dared to rise against the sovereignty. The Dread Forge descended upon them like harbingers of doom. Entire cities were reduced to rubble in moments, their inhabitants consumed by waves of psionic energy that tore through flesh and stone alike. The air was thick with the stench of burning metal and the cries of the dying. Ceres Kale and her team arrived on one such colony too late to stop the carnage. They stood on the edge of a smoking crater, The remnants of a once thriving city sprawled out before them. The ground was scorched black, the charred skeletons of buildings jutting out like broken teeth. Fires raged unchecked, casting an eerie orange glow against the darkened sky. Ceres' heart clenched as she took in the devastation. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crackle of flames and the distant groan of collapsing structures. She could feel the weight of every life lost pressing down on her, a heavy, suffocating grief that threatened to consume her. One of her team members, a young soldier named Callan, fell to his knees, his voice trembling. How do we fight this?" he whispered, his eyes wide with horror. Ceres didn't answer immediately. She stepped forward, her boots crunching against the scorched earth, and knelt to pick up a small, charred object, a child's toy, its edges melted and blackened. Her fingers tightened around it, her jaw clenching as a surge of anger and sorrow coursed through her. "This is what they want," she said finally, her voice low but steady. "They want us to break. To give in to fear." She turned to face her team, her eyes burning with a fierce determination. "But we are more than this. Humanity is more than this. Every life they take, every world they destroy, it only strengthens our resolve." Her words cut through the despair like a blade, igniting a spark in the hearts of those around her. Callan rose to his feet, his expression hardening. The others followed, their fear tempered by a growing determination. The sovereignty unleashed the dread forged on world after world, their monstrous forms leaving trails of destruction wherever they went. But instead of crushing the rebellion, they became a rallying cry. Across the galaxy, humanity rose in defiance. Survivors of the attacks banded together, their grief and rage fueling their determination to fight back. Colonies that had once been divided now stood united, their banners flying high against the darkness. The dread forged, meant to be the sovereignty's ultimate weapon, had become a symbol of their desperation. And with every act of destruction, the rebels' resolve only grew stronger. Ceres Kale knew the fight ahead would be unlike anything they had faced before. The dread forged were more than machines, they were nightmares made flesh. But humanity had faced extinction before, and they had risen from the ashes. As she stood amidst the ruins of the colony, the distant stars shimmering above her, Ceres made a silent vow. The sovereignty had unleashed its last resort, but it would not be enough. Humanity would endure. Humanity would rise. And the dread forged, like the empire that had created them, would fall. The Vault of Shadows was a place of legend, whispered about in the darkest corners of rebel camps and feared even by those loyal to the sovereignty. Hidden deep within the heart of a dying star, it was said to be a fortress of unimaginable horrors, a place where the sovereignty's darkest secrets were born. Now, it was their destination. Ceres Kale stood aboard the rebel transport, staring out at the swirling expanse of the dying star. Its light was dim and sickly, casting an eerie glow over the jagged asteroid field that surrounded it. The star's surface rippled with waves of molten fire, its death throws a haunting backdrop to their mission. The vault was buried somewhere within that chaos, protected by layers of impenetrable defenses and the crushing gravity of the star itself. Her team was silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts. They knew this was a suicide mission. The sovereignty would never let them leave alive, and even if they succeeded, there was no guarantee they could escape the star's pull. But none of them hesitated. They had seen the destruction wrought by the dread forged. They had witnessed entire worlds reduced to ash. If this was the price of stopping the sovereignty's monstrosities, then so be it. The transport shuddered as it pierced the outer layers of the star's atmosphere, the heat and turbulence rattling through its hull. Ceres gripped the edge of her seat, her knuckles white, and cast a glance at her team. "This is it," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging outside. We go in, plant the charges, and get out. No hesitation. No second guessing. We finished this. The Vault of Shadows was a labyrinth of cold, black metal, its walls pulsing faintly with an unnatural energy. The air was thick and oppressive, carrying a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of their throats. The corridors twisted and turned in ways that defied logic, as if the structure itself was alive, shifting to confuse and disorient intruders. Ceres led the way, her every sense on high alert. The sovereignty's guards were few but formidable, their movements precise and mechanical, their eyes glowing with the same sickly light as the dread forged. The team moved like shadows, dispatching them swiftly and silently, their footsteps muffled against the cold floors. As they delved deeper into the vault, the air grew colder, the faint hum of machinery growing louder. The walls seemed to close in around them, the oppressive energy pressing against their minds like a vice. Ceres could feel an unnatural presence, something dark and ancient, radiating from the heart of the facility. And then they found it. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in darkness. In its center stood the source of the dread forged, a massive, pulsating structure of metal and flesh, its surface writhing with veins of glowing energy. Around it were rows upon rows of pods, each one containing a human form suspended in a sickly green fluid. Some were lifeless, their bodies twisted and broken. Others were awake, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths frozen in silent screams. The truth hit them like a blow. The sovereignty had not merely created the dread forge, they had born them, using human prisoners as raw material. The constructs were not machines. They were people, twisted and mutilated beyond recognition, their bodies fused with metal, their minds enslaved by Shinic technology. Ceres felt her stomach turn, her vision blurring with rage. Her fists clenched at her sides as she stared at the grotesque machinery, the weight of the sovereignty's atrocities crashing down on her. "Monsters," she whispered, her voice trembling with fury. "They turned them into monsters." Callan, standing beside her, looked as though he might be sick. "We have to stop this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have to destroy it all." Ceres nodded, her jaw set. "We will." The team worked quickly, planting explosives around the chamber. Every movement was precise, every second counted. The hum of the machinery grew louder, as if the vault itself was aware of their presence, its defenses stirring to life. As they placed the final charge, the alarms sounded. The walls lit up with crimson warning lights, and the air was filled with the sound of pounding footsteps. Ceres turned to her team, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Move. We're out of time." They fought their way back through the corridors, the sovereignty's guards closing in around them. The air was thick with the sound of gunfire and the clash of blades, the walls illuminated by flashes of light. Ceres led the charge, her every strike fueled by the fury burning in her chest. By the time they reached the exit, their numbers had dwindled. 2 of their team had fallen, their bodies left behind in the chaos. Ceres didn't look back. She couldn't. The transport was waiting for them, its engines roaring as it struggled against the star's pull. Ceres and the remaining team members leapt aboard, the doors slamming shut behind them. As the ship pulled away, Ceres activated the detonator. The Vault of Shadows erupted in a blinding explosion, its dark walls consumed by fire and light. The dying star seemed to roar in protest, its molten surface churning as the facility collapsed into its core. For a moment, the light was so bright it seemed to pierce the heavens, a beacon of defiance against the darkness. As the transport sped away, the team sat in silence, the weight of their losses heavy on their shoulders. Ceres stared out at the fading light of the star, her expression unreadable. The destruction of the vault had come at a great cost, But it was a cost they had been willing to pay. The Dreadforged were no more. The sovereignty's greatest weapon had been destroyed, its dark secrets laid bare. And though the fight was far from over, one thing was clear: humanity would not be broken. Ceres closed her eyes, the image of the pods burned into her mind. She made a silent vow to the lives lost, both in the vault and beyond. The sovereignty would pay for what they had done. And one day, the galaxy would be free. The galaxy trembled under the weight of rebellion. With the destruction of the Dreadforged, the sovereignty's iron grip began to loosen. Entire sectors, once loyal to Emperor Varric, turned their backs on his crumbling regime. Fleets defected, colonies rose in open defiance, and the sovereignty's forces were stretched thin, their power eroding like sand slipping through clenched fingers. At the heart of this uprising stood Ceres Kale, her name now spoken with reverence and hope. She had become more than a leader, she was a symbol of humanity's unyielding spirit. And now, she led the Eclipse Rebellion in its final, fateful assault on Zarinth Prime, the sovereignty's capital and the seat of Varric's power. The skies above Zarinth Prime burned with the fury of battle. Rebel ships descended in waves, their hulls scarred but their resolve unbroken. The sovereignty's defenses fought back with desperate ferocity. Massive cannons fired beams of searing light, and swarms of fighters filled the void like angry hornets. But the rebels pressed on, their determination a force that no weapon could extinguish. Ceres piloted her ship through the chaos, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and purpose. Explosions erupted around her, lighting up the darkness like dying stars. She could hear the voices of her comrades over the comms, shouting orders, rallying one another, refusing to give in. "Stay on target," Ceres commanded, her voice cutting through the static. "We take the capital, we end this war." The rebel fleet broke through the sovereignty's outer defenses, their ships descending toward the sprawling city below. Zarinth Prime shimmered with the cold, sterile light of its towering spires, its streets lined with statues and banners proclaiming the glory of Emperor Varric. But now, those symbols of power were tarnished, marred by the flames of rebellion. Ceres and her team landed near the sovereignty's palace, a monolithic structure of black stone that loomed over the city like a shadow. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning metal. The sounds of battle echoed through the streets: shouts, gunfire, the distant roar of explosions. They fought their way through the palace's defenses, each step a struggle against the sovereignty's elite guards. The halls were lined with opulence, gilded walls, intricate mosaics, and towering statues of Varric himself. But none of it mattered now. The rebels moved with grim determination, their every action fueled by the knowledge of what they were fighting for. At last, they reached the throne room. The doors were massive, carved with depictions of Varric's conquests, but they could not withstand the force of the rebels' explosives. They shattered inward, revealing a cavernous chamber bathed in cold, blue light. At its center sat Emperor Varric, his throne a jagged construct of black metal and crystal. He rose as they entered, his figure imposing despite the lines of age and desperation etched into his face. His eyes burned with fury, his voice a thunderous roar that echoed through the chamber. "You dare bring your chaos here?" he spat, his gaze locking onto Ceres. "You think you've won? All you've done is tear the galaxy apart. You've destroyed order, and for what? Anarchy? Madness." Ceres stepped forward, her weapon lowered but her presence commanding. Her voice was calm, cold, and unyielding. "You burned Terra," she said, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "Now we burn you?" Varric's rage turned to fear as Ceres raised her weapon. He lunged toward her, his movements fueled by desperation, but it was over in moments. A single shot rang out, and Emperor Varric fell, his body crumpling at the base of his throne. The sovereignty had fallen. The galaxy was silent in the aftermath of the sovereignty's collapse. For the first time in generations, the oppressive weight of Varric's rule was gone. The stars, once darkened by the shadow of his empire, now seemed to shine brighter, as if the universe itself was exhaling in relief. But the work was far from over. The Eclipse Rebellion, now victorious, faced a choice. They could claim the sovereignty's power, take its place, and rule over the galaxy as conquerors. But Ceres Kale refused. She had not fought to replace one empire with another. Instead, the rebellion dismantled the systems of oppression piece by piece. The sovereignty's fleets were disbanded, its fortresses abandoned, its banners burned. In their place, they built something new, a galaxy founded on freedom, unity, and the belief that no one should ever wield the kind of power that Varric had abused. Ceres stood on the bridge of her ship, gazing out at the stars. Beside her was Darren, her oldest friend and one of the few who had survived the long, bloody fight. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes held a quiet pride. "We did it," he said softly, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. Ceres nodded, her gaze distant. "We did. But the fight isn't over. It never will be. Freedom isn't something you win, it's something you protect. Every day." Darren smiled faintly. "And we'll protect it. Together." Their story spread across the galaxy, whispered in the dark corners of cantinas, sung in the streets of liberated worlds, and etched into the hearts of those who had suffered under the sovereignty's rule. Ceres, Darren, and the other survivors became legends, their names immortalized in the annals of history. But more than their names, it was their message that endured. The galaxy remembered Terra not as a planet that had died, but as a symbol of resilience and vengeance. Its ashes had given rise to a movement that refused to be extinguished, a flame that burned brighter with every act of defiance. And in the quiet moments, when the stars seemed to hum with the echoes of the past, a single phrase could be heard, carried across the void. Terra remembers. Terra rises. Terra prevails.